And welcome to the Center for International Development First Roads to GEM 2023, Climate and Development Series. I am Emile Giovanni-Zunon. I am a student at the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard and a CID student ambassador. CID Road to GEM 2023 Climate and Development Series precede and help the launch CID's May 2023 Global Empowerment Meeting, GEM 2023, Growing in a Green World. This spring, CID strives to elevate and learn from voices from the countries on the front line of the climate crisis, and we feature important learning from the leaders who will be active participants at the Global Empowerment Meeting 2023. I look forward to today's discussion on climate change in Africa, exploring citizen experiences and perspective. The format for today's session is roughly a 30 to 35-minute presentation and around 20 minutes for Q&A. Before we get started, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. First, during the question and answer session, you can submit questions directly in the Q&A chats, and I will ask them out loud. We are also recording today's session. This event will be available on the CID YouTube channel. We'll be hosting more Road to Global Empowerment Meeting 2023 even this semester, along with our standard Friday speaker series. So make sure to subscribe to our communication and check our website frequently to learn more about programming that may interest you. We'll add links to the chat so you can all sign up for our newsletter and social media channel to hear more from CID. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Joseph Asunka, CEO of Afrobarometer, a Pan-African non-partisan survey research network that conducts public attitude survey on democracy, governance, economy, and society, headquartered in Ghana. Joseph was previously program speaker in the Global Development and Population Program at the William and Flora Helwet Foundation, where he managed a portfolio of grants that support efforts to increase transparency and accountability in fiscal governance and foster citizen participation to improve public services in Africa. Before joining Helwet, Joseph was a lecturer in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he taught courses on African politics, political economy of development, research method, and data analysis. Joseph's research interests include distributive politics, elections, and electoral processes and migration. He has published in journals such as the British Journal of Political Science, Journal of Modern African Studies, Research and Politics, Population Research and Policy Review, and Social Science and Medicine. Joseph holds first and second degrees in statistics and computer science and economics from the University of Ghana, Legon, and PhD in political science from the University of California at Los Angeles. Thank you, Joseph, and over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Emil, for the introduction, and really grateful to be here this morning. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Fatima Suma, the director of the Center for International Development at Harvard, and also the Harvard CID team for putting this together, and also inviting Afrobarometer to share some of the results on citizen experiences and evaluations of climate change issues in Africa. So we're grateful to be part of this series, and we look forward to engaging with you and participants who are tuning in today. Also to say a big thank you to everyone for tuning in. Grateful to engage with you. I want this to be more of a discussion than just speaking or talking at you. And so I'll first of all share briefly some of the results that we are beginning to get from the current or our ongoing round of surveys on climate change. And this speaker series is focused on climate change. So I'm going to focus the presentation or the findings and the results on that, but I'm open to answering or responding to any question that colleagues might have about Afrobarometer or in general our climate change module. So let me first start with an introduction to Afrobarometer. There's for the sake of those who are encountering us for the first time, but also I know people may know our work, but not necessarily into detail. So I want to share briefly about who we are. So first, let me share my screen and then I'll take it in there 1 second. All right, I hope folks can see this. Okay, so I'm starting off with what the Afrobarometer is. So first of all, as Emil mentioned, we are a Pan-African survey research network. What we do is to gather people's views, attitudes, and opinions about issues that affect their daily lives on the continent. And if you talk in the US context, this is similar to what Pew Research does in the United States. The overall goal of Afrobarometer is to give African public a voice in policymaking. That's the key consideration. And we do this because when Africa started to democratize in the early or late 1980s through the early 1990s, there was the thinking behind the fact that if democracy is to thrive on the continent, we need to bring people along. It shouldn't just be the economic, political, or social elites that are driving the agenda of democracy. If you want to entrench democracy, it has to also come from the bottom. And that's why the Afrobarometer was set up in 1999 to ensure that people's voices are part of the discussion and any decisions around governance issues. So since 1999, we've completed 8 rounds of surveys. Our round of surveys usually take between 18 to 24 months. And so we've completed 8 rounds of surveys. We are currently underway conducting the round 9 surveys, and we are hoping to be able to cover up to 40 countries. All right, so what are the key objectives of Afrobarometer? We have 3 main objectives. So the overarching goal is to give people a voice in policy making, but we have 3 key objectives. First is to produce reliable data on popular attitudes on the continent. The second is to broadly disseminate and apply our survey results, because we want to promote evidence-based advocacy and policy making on the continent. And the third is to strengthen survey research, analysis, and communication skills, and this particularly targeting young people on the continent. We strive to strengthen survey research because we do believe that African societies need to have people on the continent who understand the context and can conduct research in ways that can go to inform policy. So in addition to creating the data, making it available to policymakers, to researchers and academics like your institution, we also built the capacity of young people on the continent to be able to continue doing this work. All right, so where we work, these are the places, the field in countries are where we work. We started in 1999 with only 12 countries. And the 12 countries are the ones shaded in orange here. I hope you've seen it as orange shaded. So we started from those 12 countries and have since expanded to cover more and more of the continent. So as you can see, our ideal would be that we should cover the entire continent, but of course, certain conditions do not allow us to cover the entire continent. And I will briefly talk about some of those conditions shortly. But just to highlight that this time around, we will be covering Mauritania. And so Mauritania will be filled in the next time I present these results. You'll find Mauritania filled in. You'll also see Guinea-Bissau will be filled in, and the Seychelles will also be filled in because we have covered these countries for this round of the survey. All right, so as I mentioned, you can see we haven't covered the entire continent yet, especially the middle part of the continent. Whenever we're going into any country, there are certain factors that we consider before we are able to get into any country to conduct surveys. There are 3 key primary factors. First of all, is the sufficient political openness. So when we started in 1999, we only had 12 countries, the 12 countries that were shaded in orange, that were politically open enough for us to conduct surveys. But since then, more and more countries have opened up politically, and that's why we've expanded coverage. There has to be an adequate sampling frame. And by that, we mean we should have a population census that is not older than 10 years, or even if it is older than 10 years, that there are realistic projections, population projections that allow us to draw a truly representative national sample from each country. And the third consideration is the availability of a national partner. The Afrobarometer works through national partners. So in each country, we have an institution, whether it's a think tank, a private survey firm, or a research institute within a university that leads the surveys. We organize ourselves into this kind of network and have local partners because we know that it is local partners who understand the context and can conduct the surveys and, of course, drive the advocacy in their respective countries. And so we don't fly people in to conduct surveys. We have local partners that lead these surveys in their respective countries. So these are the three primary conditions. If those are fulfilled, then there are some secondary considerations. First of all, is there safety and security, that our teams can go into the field because our surveys are conducted face-to-face. And the only way we can get in and conduct a survey is if there's, if security is assured. If we are not sure about security, then that's always a problem. So you can see for some of the countries that we haven't covered, by and large, it has been a combination of insecurity and also the non-availability of the census data that is as recent as 10 years. The second, of course, is government clearance. In some countries, it's not always the case that government will give us a go-ahead, but we always need the government's buy-in before we can get into conduct the surveys. So if the government refuses to allow us to conduct surveys, we certainly wouldn't go in. There have been a few cases where governments have kicked us out because they don't like our results. And the reason being that we ask questions that touch on politics and governance, and sometimes those results are not flattering, and we get into trouble with some governments. But that's been just isolated cases. Sometimes it can be current events like COVID-19 and other natural disasters that, and even man-made disasters like coups that would prevent us from entering in a country. And of course, the underlying factor being the availability of funding to conduct these surveys. All right, so I'm going to turn on to the topics we cover, and some of the topics we cover I've listed down here. At the top are topics that we cover from round to round. We keep these topics for each round because we want to be able to track the trends over time. So for example, quality of elections or issues about poverty, political participation. If we started from 1999 and we are able to track the trends over time to see how people's views and experiences are changing over time with respect to some of these topics. For each round, we also would usually include special topics, and the determination of special topics is informed by the debates that are going on at the time that we're conducting the surveys. And so, for example, in 2020, when COVID-19 hit, that became a topical policy issue, and we covered it as part of our surveys. And we still have some of the questions in our current survey, and we're planning to have some of the questions on COVID-19 in the subsequent survey, in the round 10 survey, which is coming up. The same way with gender equality and gender-based violence, we talked about child welfare, migration, taxation, social cohesion. So it will always depend on what is the topical policy issue on the continent and what is the topical policy issue globally that we should be covering. You'll realize for today's presentation is going to focus on climate change, and climate change has been one of the big topics that is both on the continent and globally has become an important issue for policymakers, for everybody, and so climate change is now part and parcel of our surveys. We started asking these questions in 2017, and we'll continue to follow through. And I'll share some results on some of the findings that we have on climate change today with you. And so what's our methodology? It's our methodology in brief. What we normally do is select a nationally representative sample of citizens 18 years and above. Of course, we start from 18 years and above, largely because this is the voting age, and most of the questions that we track over time do have issues to do with, the adult population, but also interviewing minors can bring a lot of complications. At this point, we are still figuring out best ways to capture the views of much younger people, less than 18 years. But for now, our samples are based on 18 years and above. Their surveys are done face-to-face. We know that increasingly people use different methods, whether it is internet-based or phone-based surveys and the like. But for the context in which we work, face-to-face interviews remain the gold standard, and that's what we continue to use for now. We have a standard questionnaire that we use across all countries. And so what that enables us to do is to be able to compare results across countries. So what are people's evaluations of their president's performance? We can compare Zimbabwe and Malawi and Kenya because we ask the same question in the same way across all the countries. And for the face-to-face interviews, we do allow respondents to choose the language that they want to be asked in, or to be interviewed in. This is possible because we translate the instrument into local languages. So in each country, if there's a language that is spoken by more than 5% of the population, we translate the questionnaire or the instrument into all those languages. Our sample sizes range from 1,200 to 2,400, and in statistical terms, this gives us a margin of error of ±3 or ±2. Depending on whether it is 1,200 or 2,400. Sometimes we have some numbers in between, largely because we would sometimes oversample from certain populations to take into account some nuances that we want to find in the specific countries. All right, so that's it about Afrobarometer methodology and everything else, and more than happy to respond to any questions about methodology and approaches to this. But as I said, all of this work is done in about 40 countries throughout the continent. So I'm going to turn now to the climate change in Africa, exploring citizens' experiences, just to give you a brief overview of some of the results that we've been getting from the current ongoing survey, but a little bit about also some of the findings that we've had in the past surveys, the past 3 surveys. So starting off, usually what we do is the first question to our respondents is simply to ask them whether they are aware of climate change. Yeah, so just asking people's awareness, we think it's critical because being aware of the phenomenon is one thing, and of course people also experience it in different ways. And so it's both just being aware of the concept of climate change, but also experiencing some of the effects of it on the continent. So what we ask people, our questions are normally about people's awareness of it, their experiences, and some kinds of evaluations in terms of whether they think governments and other stakeholders are doing a good job in terms of addressing or mitigating climate change. All right, so how we look across the continent on average. So the data we have for this presentation, when we started the surveys in 2021, and they are still ongoing. We should be concluding by the end of March, or at least early April, would have concluded it. But at the end of 2022, we had data sets that are ready for 20 countries. So I'm going to present the data, the results on the 20 countries that we have data for the current round of the surveys. As you can see, the 20-country average here is 51%. So of all our respondents across these 20 countries, just about half of them told us that they are aware of climate change. But you can see that there's a lot of variation, from very high, from 74% all the way down to 22%. And usually, this data is kind of interesting for different countries because yes, knowing that the population is aware or not aware of climate change can be an important, data point for decision makers in terms of what it means to engage in climate mitigation issues. If the population is not even aware of the phenomenon, how do you go about addressing it in ways that resonates with them? So the first thing might be raising some awareness. So what we're seeing here, there's still quite a bit of work to do, especially in some of the countries, to raise awareness about what climate change is. The second, what we try to do here is to break down the awareness of climate change by some of the key demographics that we have, so gender, rural, urban, age, and then experiences of poverty and the like, and formal education. What we see here is when we disaggregate by these demographics, the key thing that seems to be emerging is that probably education plays a role, and yes, that cannot be discounted. If you look at it, those with post-secondary education, you have about 73% of them being aware, compared to 36% of those without formal education. But then if we look further, it does seem like we also have big gaps between men and women, and also between rural and urban populations. But let me just digress a little here to say, for the gender gaps and the rural-urban gaps, one might think, okay, it could also be a factor of education, because we know that usually, urban folks are more likely to have more formal education than rural folks. And the same way on the continent, women tend to have less access, at least compared to men, less access to formal education. So it does seem like education may be playing a role here, because if you look at just education, yes, more people with post-secondary education seem to be more aware of climate change. But then these results do present a puzzle. Is it all about education, or it is something else? If I go a step back to the previous slide, you will see here that we have climate awareness is the highest in Malawi. And for people who study or know Africa very well, Malawi is one of the countries with the lowest rates of formal education. And it is almost at par with Botswana, which is one of the countries with the highest rate of education on the continent. And so even though the breakdown of this data seems to suggest that education may be playing a role, it is likely that it's not just education. There may be other factors, because Malawi is the place with the lowest rates of formal education, and yet they have the highest awareness of climate change on the continent. I'm raising this puzzle here because to make 2 points. One, of course, this is an academic community, and I think puzzles like this can be intriguing, and sometimes they can lead to a deeper investigation into what is it that is actually driving awareness of climate change on the continent. And so on the face of it, it might look like education, but maybe it is not. But more importantly and more broadly, what I want to underscore here is that Afrobarometer data sometimes can create these puzzles. So you see a pattern and you think that this is a consistent pattern that might explain some dynamics in terms of people's attitudes and evaluations. But when you dig deeper, you realize there are some puzzles that may emerge in the process. And I think as an academic or research institution, and of course, students of Africa studies or African politics, you might find this to be intriguing. What is it that is driving people's attitudes or awareness of climate change? And it could lead to some more nuanced research that allows us to learn more and contribute to knowledge in this sense. So I hope that many of you will take some time to explore the Afrobarometer data. We have a very nice online data analysis tool. If you go to our website, you can easily do the analysis online. And you can come across some of these puzzles, and it might trigger you to think about what is it that I can explore more in terms of some of the drivers of attitudes on the continent, just to plug that in here for folks who may be interested in exploring more. All right, so the next thing we ask our respondents is about droughts and floods. Some of you may know there have been extreme weather conditions, of course, across the globe, everywhere, but also in Africa. We have floods in places like Nigeria and Chad. These are not countries that have experienced floods in the past, but now we're seeing that these are growing in intensity. Uganda, Ethiopia also experiencing droughts, and Uganda is not known to be the country that has experienced droughts, for at least for the previous several decades is not a phenomenon, but it's becoming more common. Cyclones occurring in Madagascar, Mozambique, and the like. And so we asked our respondents about the severity of droughts and floods. And you can see it here. On average, across the 20 countries that we surveyed, about half, that's 47%. That tell us that droughts have become more severe. And this, of course, is a majority view in Madagascar, Niger, and Tunisia. They express this view. And the same way in Lesotho, Mauritius, we see high rates of reports about floods in their countries. So there is a general sense, of course, people are experiencing this. In Afrobarometer surveys, it's not just people's opinions. We actually are interested in their experiences, and that's the benefit or the value of what we have in Afrobarometer, capturing people's experiences and not just opinions. We also ask about the impact of climate change. So across the 20 countries that we surveyed, for those that say they are aware of climate change, we ask them what has been the impact. Does it make life better or worse? And you can see it from here, nearly unanimous, except for Namibia, where we have 49%. On average, we have almost close to 80% across the 20 countries that tell us that climate change is making life more difficult. And so, the sense we get here is some of the effects of climate change, and for those who are aware of it, this is the sentiment that it is making life more difficult for them. In previous rounds in the 2017 survey, we asked our respondents what they think is the cause of climate change. And for those who are aware of climate change, the majority told us it's human activity that is driving climate change. We had about close to 30% telling us that it is natural causes, and telling us that. So we asked this question just to document for people who are aware of climate change, what do they think is driving this? We have more than half telling us it's driven by human activity. All right. Then the other part, and I alluded to this earlier on, is the performance of their governments in terms of addressing climate change. So we ask our respondents, do you think your government is doing enough to address climate change? And here, as I said, in addition to which is not just the experiences, but we also capture how people evaluate the performance of their governments or different institutions in their country. And so across all the topics that we study, one is experiences, but also the second thing is evaluating the performance of different stakeholders. So with respect to climate change, when we ask, on average, we have 51% giving their governments positive marks in terms of their performance in tackling climate change. And then, of course, we do have this as high as 67% in some countries, in Lesotho, for example, giving their governments failing marks. And then, of course, that varies down to Sierra Leone, where we have about 35%. But it's worth noting here that in countries like Benin and Togo, as well as Niger, they do give their government some positive marks in terms of their performance in tackling climate change in their countries. So, based on how governments are performing, we asked people about their views in terms of action. So when we ask whether they think governments should take steps to limit climate change, even if doing so would be expensive or cause some harm to the economy or even cause some job losses. Here we ask this question, not just whether or not they think government should take action, but whether if government is taking action and that action is leading to some negative consequences on their own economy, whether or not government should still proceed. And as you can see here, we have across the board, majority of citizens saying, agreeing very strongly with the statement that government should take action to address climate change, even if it has some negative consequences like job losses in their countries. I think this point is important because it sends the signal that people are willing to make some sacrifices and accommodate actions or policy decisions that would lead to, an improvement or at least limiting the further changing the climate that they experience. All right, so from there, we don't just stop, but we go on to ask people, who do you think is responsible for limiting climate change? And this has been a debate that is ongoing across the globe in terms of who should be responsible for limiting climate change. So across the 20 countries where we surveyed, on average, we have 45% saying that it is the responsibility of governments to limit climate change. But what's surprised, and of course, came to us as a pleasant surprise, I should say, is that we have 31% putting it on citizens themselves, that ordinary citizens do have the responsibility to limit climate change. And then we have about 12% saying that it is a responsibility of the developed world or developed nations. Now, of course, usually in the climate debate, there's always a sense that Africa contributes very little to greenhouse emissions. So why should they be responsible, or that countries that have benefited from economic activity that has led to the deterioration in our climate in a way that is bringing up some of these negative effects, they should be responsible for limiting climate change. But as you can see here, I think by and large, ordinary Africans or citizens on the continent do believe that the fight against climate change is a shared responsibility. It's not just a government matter or the international community, but that it is a shared responsibility among their own governments, they themselves as citizens, and to the international community. But that said, you can see that there's a lot of variation across the different countries. And so in countries like Nigeria, Niger, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe and Senegal, there's a sense that, of course, here we have in these four countries, majority of citizens put it on their governments, that governments should be the main, should be more responsible for limiting climate change. And on the other end of it, you will see that in Tunisia, Tunisians majority put the blame on the international community or the developed world, that the rich or developed countries should be responsible for limiting climate change. But on average, it is a general sentiment that it is a shared responsibility. And this data is important, of course, these results are important because you need to know, even though when we talk of average, there's the sense of a shared responsibility. If you have to do some work in Tunisia about climate change and limiting climate change, there the sentiment is very different, and knowing that is important. And even in Gabon, we have almost close to 40% saying that it is a responsibility of the rich or developed nations. And so the value of Afrobarometer data is that it gives you this sense of the cross-country variation that allows you to say, if we're going to implement a climate change policy in Tunisia, what will be the approach? Or if you're going to implement it in Nigeria, what will be the approach? Because if most Nigerians say it is a responsibility of governments, the policy options will be different. And if you go to Tunisia, most of them feel that it is the rich or developed nations' responsibility. That has implications for what kinds of policy you adopt. And that's, I think, is usually the beauty of Afrobarometer data, for having this cross-country competency that allow people to make different decisions depending on the policy issue they are trying to address. All right, now the sense of unequally shared responsibility comes up even more when we ask people about whether citizens can play a role to limit climate change. So here I've put together comparing those who call on government to take action and those who feel that citizens have a role to play. You can see they are almost at par, and that citizens have a role to play, and then calling on governments to take action. The proportions that support both ideas, propositions, are almost at par. And I think this is also another picture showing that there is a sense that citizens themselves have a responsibility or a role to play in limiting climate change. And I always tell my colleagues this, I think this presents a conducive picture for adopting some of the climate change policies on the continent, especially when it comes to adopting policies that are really difficult to implement. I do think just knowing that this is the sentiment of citizens of the continent can be very useful. All right, and then the next one is we go on to ask our respondents to tell us whether or not they think the various stakeholders are doing enough to address climate change. So are governments doing enough? Is the developed world doing enough? Is the business or private sector doing enough? And are citizens themselves doing enough? And you can see across the board, there is a sense that there's a need to do more. We have majority of citizens telling us that all key stakeholders in the fight against climate change need to either do a lot more or do at least some more of what, and of course across the board you see that majority is a majority view that there's a need to do a lot more in limiting climate change on the continent. All right, and so these are the key data points that I have to share with you this morning. I'm just now going to segue into talking about the role that Afrobarometer plays when it comes to some of these issues, the way we engage, how we disseminate and bring the data into public discourse. So first of all, we start with what we call the counter dispatches. Usually at the end of each survey round, we produce really publications that are easy to read and understand, and even comfortable for people who may not be very comfortable with numbers. But what these dispatches do is to break it down in a way that even somebody who is not comfortable with numbers can read and understand what it means. And this can be very relevant often for policymakers, decision makers who want quick information to feed into their decision-making process. And so we produce these counter dispatches in all the countries on all the thematic areas that we cover. And these are just examples of some of the dispatches that we have produced on climate change and environmental governance in the latest round of the survey. The second component is we started to produce what we call country climate cards. And so for each country, we produce an infographic that captures in a snapshot some of the key data points about climate change in the respective countries. And we have these climate scorecards or climate cards for each of the countries that we cover in the surveys. And we'll continue to produce these across. These will be relevant both for thinking about the current conditions or current views on the continent in the respective countries, but also thinking about overtime tracking attitudes and views. For example, is awareness of climate change increasing or is it declining over time? And then the other piece is just getting this data and analysis to key audiences, both on the continent and outside the continent. And so what we've done is to partner with this publication called The Continent. The Continent publication that provides really good impartial analysis of current issues on the continent. And what we've done is to partner with them to have a data page where every week we produce a data page on a particular topic that is relevant for policymakers or decision making on the continent. And this publication has been ongoing for some time now and will continue to do that. And I would certainly put a good plug here for the continent, because this is a real publication that for people who are interested in understanding current issues and a balanced analysis of issues on the continent. This is a publication that is really, really very relevant for the fact that, of course, Afrobarometer has a data page in it, but the fact that these are folks that really produce quality analysis that we have valued and continue to engage with them on. The third piece is, of course, global audiences. We do partner with media and other research institutes across the globe to make sure that the data reaches a global audience. And so we used to have publications in the Washington Post. We also have engagements with the US Institute of Peace, the European Institute of Security Studies, several institutions across the globe where Afrobarometer data is vital for some of the work that they do, and we'll bring it to them, and also to make sure it reaches a global audience. And of course, the Afrobarometer data is used severally in several governance indices across the globe. So whether you're talking of the World Bank governance indicators or the Economist Intelligence Unit's analysis or the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index, all of these, some of the underlying data is drawn from the Afrobarometer. And this is made possible because our data is public. We create it as a public good and it's available and accessible to everybody. It is not gated in any way. So if you go to our website, you can download data sets and do your own analysis or use our online data analysis to create any graphs that create an analysis that may be relevant for whatever way you do. All right, so just a few concluding remarks to capture some of the key takeaways from the results of climate change. The first thing is that climate change awareness is not yet that widespread on the continent. We only have about half of respondents from the 20 countries that we've covered so far being aware of this phenomenon. But so for those who are aware of climate change, there is this broad consensus that it is making life more difficult for them. And there's widespread demand for governments to act to limit climate change. And of course, even if this comes at some expense, people are willing that it should be a priority for governments. And there's this firm view that climate action is a shared responsibility across the different key stakeholders, governments, citizens themselves, the international community, and the private sector. Because citizens are willing to engage in climate, limiting or climate mitigation actions, and even to some extent make sacrifices if there's a need to. And as I said at the beginning, this is also useful in our context and does provide relevant information for people to think about the fact that when you're adopting a climate change policy, it may be more acceptable than people would otherwise think. But there's a widespread view that stakeholders are not doing enough. And I think this is a call to the global community and of course to Africa and African governments in terms of what they do in limiting climate change, because citizens on the continent think that these key stakeholders are not doing enough to limit climate change. All right, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Emil, and I'll turn it back to you and see if there are any questions. I'm more than happy to respond to. So thanks for listening, everybody.